Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. Tucked in amongst the numerous Baptist and Methodist churches in the High Country is a small worshiping community that has its roots in the ancient church. Saints Peter and Paul Orthodox Church represents a church tradition that is perhaps not well known in the High Country or even in the southern part of the United States. My guest today, Andy Hall, is a member of that community and will introduce us to this ancient form of Christian community. Welcome, Andy. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to just give you a chance for a moment to introduce yourself and what your role is in the church, and then we can talk a little bit about the Orthodox tradition.
Okay. My name is Andy Hall. I am mostly the chanter at Saints Peter and Paul Orthodox Church. I'm also what's called a subdeacon, which I lovingly refer to as being a liturgical house elf. And basically, a subdeacon is, on the one hand, the acolyte wrangler during the services, and on the other hand, when there's any kind of dirty job that needs to be done around the church, the subdeacon is the one that gets called to do it.
So you play a pretty important role in this community as chanter, and I want to ask you to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. And you also do the music, the choir music.
I do the choir music sometimes. Chanting can be done as a choir as well.
No.
It's not necessarily a solo act. Back in the empire, the Byzantine Empire that we call it, there was a time when Hagia Sophia would have 100 chanters on the left and 100 chanters on the right, and they were singing antiphonally all together during the services.
That must have been beautiful.
I expect it was.
Yeah. So the Orthodox faith, we don't know a lot about it in the United States. It doesn't have a huge presence here, but it is the oldest form of Christian community and worship.
Well,
we know about it,
if you ask us.
If you right.
Certainly. So back in the day, there were 5 great sees, right? There's Rome, which we're all pretty familiar with, Antioch, eventually Constantinople, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. And the church that I belong to, Saints Peter and Paul, finds its roots back in Antioch. So we are Saints Peter and Paul Antiochian Orthodox Church. Somewhere along the way, the Catholics, the Roman See, which we now call the Catholic Church, and the rest of the Orthodox churches didn't see eye to eye on a few things.
Right.
So then we had what we refer to as the Great Schism.
1054, I believe.
That's the date we assigned to it.
Yeah.
It started hundreds of years before and continued hundreds of years after.
Yeah. But for the first 1,000 years of the church, there was no division, no formal division between what we know as the Roman Catholic Church and now the Orthodox churches.
No, and it took quite a while for it to spread.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't until a few hundred years later that it was really solidified.
Right. So when we talk about the so-called church fathers in the early years, when we talk about Augustine, perhaps the greatest theologian in Christian history, we're really talking about the Orthodox tradition in this case.
It certainly overlaps.
Yes.
We don't point to Augustine primarily. We would more point to, for instance, St. John Chrysostom, who was a son of Antioch and eventually became the Patriarch of Constantinople. But we draw a lot of our theology and practice from him.
So the Patriarch of Constantinople is the leader of the church.
The leader of the Constantinopolitan Church.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right? So, in as much as we understand that the Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church,
right? Yeah.
Right? Well, we have a patriarch in Antioch, and he is our head bishop.
Yeah.
Right? Then there's also the head bishop in Constantinople.
Okay. So it's too simplistic just to speak of the Orthodox tradition. There are different branches within the Orthodox
Church. There are many.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay, I'm catching up now. All right, but the main thing is all trace their roots to some ancient form of Christianity, and so the Christianity the Christian church that comes out of the Middle East and out of Asia Minor and out of what was Byzantine Empire, then Constantinople, and now Istanbul. These are all places, North Africa.
Yeah.
These are all places in the early church that would tie together in the Orthodox traditions writ large, I guess.
Yes, and they
Yeah.
argued with each other extensively.
Well, religion does that quite well.
Yeah,
You're not you might be unique in some ways, but you're not unique in
Sure.
that you argue with each other. It's really fascinating. All right, and I just wanted to ask you. I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of the church or historians or anything, but from your perspective, what do you see as a fundamental difference that distinguishes Orthodox Christianity, say, from Roman Catholicism or even Protestantism?
Well, on an individual basis, there's generally an enormous amount of overlap, right? And I like to focus on that. But if somebody paints me into a corner and says, I really want to know what the difference here is, then there are a few things that I can mention. And I think, personally, that the biggest notable difference is a misunderstanding or misapplication of the role of the Holy Spirit in the church, right? The Protestants realized eventually that the Catholics had put too much emphasis on the Pope himself, right? And if you go through the history of how, for instance, the concept of papal infallibility came to be, and most people don't understand what that actually is, but I mean, they've got some very comedic, cartoonish idea of what papal infallibility is.
Right.
But you go through what they were trying to do in the first Vatican Council when they actually made that a doctrine. They were trying to get it to where that the Pope simply simply because he was Pope would be declared a saint. Well, they didn't get that far, that faction.
Right.
They didn't get that far. But the point here was to solidify power in this one person, right? And the Protestants recognized this is an issue, right? Who leads the church? Well, we like to say that the Holy Spirit would guide the church. Well, who actually guides the church, right? Well, with the Catholics, it's the magisterium, most notably the Pope. And the Protestants say, well, no, just one guy can't decide this, right? I've got to read the Bible myself. And ultimately, many of the Protestants have made themselves their own Pope.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Whereas the Orthodox method of leading the church is a communion, a synod, we call it the Holy Synod, right? None of the bishops is all that much more important than the other ones. Right? If the patriarch gets out of line, he can be removed. He has to be able to work with the rest of the synod. And as the apostles said in the Council of Jerusalem, when we read about that in Acts, it seemed good to the Spirit and to us, right? They lead in consensus within the Spirit of God.
So the hierarchy of the church structure, the way authority is assigned, the way the authority works.
But it's not just that, because the way we structure our ecclesiology, we're then going to support that in our service, in our worship, right? And then when our worship begins to ignore the Spirit, where we can have a priest, for example, being able to hold a mass and do the transformation of the body and blood, of the bread and wine to the body and blood, all by himself, right? In the Orthodox Church, that's not done. A priest cannot hold a liturgy by himself. He has to at least have the assent of the people, right? My priest has to have somebody there saying amen.
Yeah. So you mentioned the priest and you mentioned worship, so that's kind of a nice segue to my next point or question. What's the difference between what you do as a worship leader and what a priest in the Orthodox tradition would do as worship leader?
Well, we just have different roles, right? The priest is very specifically the sacramental leader. He is placed there by our bishop to lead us. And I just do what my bishop or my priest tells me to do, right? There are specific guides for how I'm supposed to do what I do, but there's the priest part, and then there's the chanter, reader, or people part. And I lead the people in the chanter, reader, and people part.
One of the things that occurs to me when I think about Orthodox worship is that it's a very sensory experience. This beautiful chanting and the gorgeous icons and elements of worship that try to hit on, seems to me, all the senses.
Absolutely.
How would you describe worship within the Orthodox Church as a sensory experience?
Well, we engage all the senses,
Yeah.
every single one, right? With the sense of smell, we'll have the candles going, we'll have oil lamps going, and we have incense. For the sight, we have beauty everywhere, right? Truth is found in beauty, right? So we absolutely want to make our worship space as beautiful as we can, and the icons are a part of that. And so we have it visually, tactily. We usually stand when we're doing our worship. We don't usually sit down, and so there's a physical activity involved.
Right.
You know, often during Lent we will actually bow, prostrate ourselves on the floor. You know, we engage all of the senses, and I probably missed one there, but
Well, maybe the most important for you is the sound,
the
right?
auditory.
Yeah, the auditory part. So.
Well, the way the singing is done, we want a very lively room, right? We get a sound engineer into a church these days, and what he wants to do, he wants to deaden every single thing in the room so you can't hear a single echo. We want the echo, right?
Yeah.
Because the sound that we do for Byzantine chant, we have a drone note, a foundation. We call it the ison, and then the melody is a counterpoint to that ison, or the melody is the point, and the ison's the counterpoint.
Right.
But the ison is the foundation of what's going on. So I sing, and I'm hearing that foundation as I'm singing. It's coming back to me as an echo. So the entire building then becomes the musical instrument that I'm singing with. Right, the entire temple.
That's amazing.
Is the instrument.
Yeah. So I think probably we're more familiar with Gregorian chant in the Catholic tradition. If you had to describe the difference between Gregorian chant and Byzantine chant, what would you point to? Would it be that drone note, or is that evident in Gregorian chant as well?
Though I think Gregorian uses some kind of harmony. I'm far less well versed with that. But in Byzantine chant, we in the West, we generally create and relieve tension in music by doing chord changes, right? And if you know the correct chord progression, you can pull out a guitar and sing most any popular song, and they all have the same chord progression, and it feels nice and comfortable. And what it is Paco Belcanon's in D, and that's fine. But in Byzantine chant, we do something completely different. We create and relieve tension through what we call text painting, through mode shifts. We use a slightly different scale to begin with, and we will change scales during the hymn, right? It might be bright and lively, and then when we get to a part where somebody's sin is highlighted, right? Or we're not going to leave Thomas to founder in his unbelief, right? Then that bright and lively sound will become dour. There will be what we call more chromatic sense to it, and there's that text painting brings the tension,
right?
Gives us the tension and relieves it, and that's how the Byzantine chant works.
It's interesting to hear you talk about something auditory in music as a text painting. That's a nice image.
Well, the simple one that we hear about is if you're going up to heaven, to the heavens, or down to Hades.
Gotcha.
Or if we're going to get a more chromatic bent to it, down to Hades. use, because we don't just follow, the keys on a piano. We have different intervals between our notes in Byzantine chant.
Well, you kind of broke the ice for me there, because I was going to ask you if you would mind giving us a sample of a Byzantine chant. And I know you're a little hoarse today, so maybe, but that would be wonderful if we could hear what a Byzantine chant sounds like.
So, and I'll just do a little bit to give you an idea.
Yeah.
But during Pascha, we sing about Christ rising up, right? Where it's very, very happy, very elated. It's a celebration. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death. And you can hear a similar sort of dynamic in a Greek version, right? Christos anesti ek nekron. And you can imagine underneath that, where that first note I sang, that would be pa. And I don't have much echo in here, of course, because this is a modern studio. But that note will be rumbling along as we're going.
You sing over
Christos anesti, and the whole time. It's I love it.
It's remarkable. I don't know how to quite describe the sound, but it's different from what I'm used to hearing in church music, right? And you do it beautifully.
Thank God for that.
It's easy to see why you're the chanter now. That's incredible. So you have to know Greek because you're doing some of the chanting in Greek, or do you know Greek beyond the chants themselves? Or?
So I know Greek like anybody who knows Western music knows Italian.
Okay.
Right? You know what retard is.
Yeah.
Right? You know what piano is. You know what forte is. We have similar, because it's a Greek style of music, there are certain Greek things you need to learn. And if you go to a Greek parish, you're going to need to know how to sing Christ is risen in Greek.
Right. And sometimes, well, I'm glad you mentioned Greek, because sometimes the Orthodox tradition is referred to as the Greek Orthodox tradition, but that limits it, right? I mean, that's not
there's the national boundaries of the churches, and there are 17 or so, depending on how you file the variations of the hierarchical structures. But then there's also a more general style of worship, right? Where there are generally two, though there are more than that, but we generally think in terms of the Greek typicon and the Russian typicon. The Russians have their own way of doing things, where they actually use 4-part harmonies, and they are gorgeous. But some monasteries in Russia, Valam uses a more, it's just different.
Yeah.
If you look up Valam chant on YouTube, you will be astonished at how hauntingly beautiful it is. And over the years, the Russians have developed their own sets of rubrics, and so if I generally refer to the Russian church or churches, I might be referring to that set of practices rather than the practices that we follow, which are Greek practices.
Right. Okay.
Right? But I'm not in the Greek church. I'm in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese.
And it's all very confusing.
Antioch.
Yeah, it's all
right. So we've got our own typicon that we follow.
Yeah. Wow. Well, another so the chanting was beautiful. It's very worshipful sounding, and it's distinctive. And another distinctive part of Orthodox worship and ritual that again kind of addresses the senses is what we mentioned earlier, was the use of icons.
Oh yes.
So we'll look at a couple here in a moment, but tell me what an icon is technically, because a lot of people in the Protestant church would not recognize iconography.
So what would be the usual complaint, right? This is a graven image, a false graven image. So most importantly, the quality of an icon needs to be telling the truth, right? So if we have icons of even parables, right? But they're displaying the truth that Jesus was trying to get across in telling that parable. And for most of, from a utilitarian point of view, for most of Christianity, right? How many people could actually read?
Right.
Very few, up until the last few centuries.
So
almost nobody.
So the icons, the religious art, helps to tell the story.
Helps to tell the story, right? And what makes it an icon is that it tells the truth of Jesus Christ, that it leads people to Jesus Christ. So there's a fine line some of us like to point to and say, oh no, we venerate the icon, we worship God, right? Well, okay, but in some places we use the same word in Greek for the both. So what's actually going on here? Well, what's going on here is that fine distinction of we venerate this item in remembrance, in calling to action, in leading us to God, right, to Jesus Christ, the incarnate God. We follow that. We make this distinction between that and the veneration and the worship, but it's really not a small distinction. It's a wide chasm. Right? If a thing is leading us away from Jesus Christ, well, then it's a false idol that we should not be following. And if it's leading us toward Jesus Christ, then it's a true icon.
We've got a couple of pictures here that we can look at, and maybe you can comment on them. But I know. So this is a beautiful icon. Can maybe tell me just a little bit about it? I don't think you need to unpack everything going on here, but because there's quite a lot, but maybe point out a couple of the highlights.
Well, I sent this one to you particularly for today.
Okay, yeah, right, yeah, and I love it. Yeah.
And today is?
Well, it's All Saints Day. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, Yagi.
At least it's All Saints Day in the Western tradition.
Right. This is not All Saints Day in
the Orthodox Church. Okay,
the Orthodox Church.
So go ahead.
But how much Greek do you know?
Very little.
This is the sanctified all.
Okay.
Right? This is the All Saints icon.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Who's in the middle?
Well, it looks like Christ.
It's Christ.
Yes.
With his crown. This is the king, the center of everything.
Right.
Right. And all of these people around him are the various saints.
Okay. All right. So that's and this would be. The one thing that I've read, and maybe you can comment on this, that an icon should not be too realistic, that it should be representational in a sense. Does that make sense? Is that part of what allows an icon to be venerated but not worshipped?
There are different competing ideas.
Okay.
About that.
Yeah.
I like the Byzantine style because it isn't too sensual, right? We will often say that icons are a window to heaven, but really it's a window for heaven to look at us, right? Where these figures, these people, these saints, and the incarnate God himself, right? They're still with us, they're still around,
right?
But we are not seeing them as they are exactly. Right. This is a lens that we're dealing with here. Right. And most importantly, this is telling us some aspect of truth about Jesus Christ. And we can take a step back, and he's the center of everything here.
Yeah.
Well, he ought to be the center of our lives in our tradition, right? And then there are other things that are Abram, I'm sure you can see.
Yeah. Well, I think we've got a second icon here. If we can pull that one up. This one you also sent to me. Maybe comment just briefly on what you see as the kind of central point of this.
This is the anastasis, the resurrection.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
This is what, do you see what he's got his feet standing over there?
It looks like a cross.
It does. It is a cross.
Yeah.
Those are the brass gates of Hades that he has torn down and destroyed. Right. It open locks, keys. You know, he's He's opened the tombs. He's pulling people out of the tombs.
Gotcha.
We were dead, and now we are alive in Christ.
Yeah.
Right.
So that this represents rebirth, resurrection, victory over the tomb. I guess that's the tomb in the background there.
Sure.
Okay. It's beautiful. I mean, it's just it's really, the icons are both kind of sensory delight. So it has aesthetic appeal, but and here's the key point, I think, for it to be a true icon, it has to point to Christ. So it has to have some sort of theological grounding.
Absolutely.
As well. Okay. We've got another picture here. I think this is you just recently moved into a beautiful new worship space in West Jefferson.
Very fortunate.
Yeah. So this is a photo inside. I believe it's your priest.
Yes, this is Father Vasile.
Okay. And then you have icons in the worship space along the walls, along the back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I wish we had more.
well, you just moved in. I say you're off to a great start. Tell us about this new space briefly, because I know you're very proud to be there.
We are delighted.
Yeah, you spent a lot of 10 years in a strip mall.
We've spent a couple of different 10 years in a couple of different strip malls.
And to be honest, I've been there, so it was a beautiful space in the strip mall, but not quite to compete with this. So.
Right. To actually have our own room, and I was mentioning using the room as the instrument when I sing.
Right.
Right. This is night and day compared to a room that is designed to deaden sound.
Sure.
And this is very lively. Right. So the chanter, that's what I focus on when we get in there. The first thing I did was start singing something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And what's the significance of the panels behind the priest here? Is this a holy space, or is this a place to display icons, or how would you describe the altar itself?
This harkens back to how the Jews laid out their temple, very generally. And the altar is indeed behind that. And we have icons of Christ, the Theotokos, the Mother of God, Saint John the Baptist, and on the other side, you probably can't see it, but it's Saints Peter and Paul. And they are the patrons of our church, and so we bring them to mind a lot during our services. Yeah. And hopefully in our own personal prayers too, because they care for us and hopefully lead us toward Christ.
Yeah.
And then the ones at the top, you can probably tell that that's the Last Supper above the central door, and the smaller ones up top are various festal icons.
Okay. You mentioned the Theotokos, which is, I think, literally God bearer.
Birth giver of God.
Birth giver. Okay. Yeah. So this is Mary.
Yes.
I know Mary has a rather high role to play in the Roman Catholic Church. Does she play a similarly important role in Orthodox worship?
Absolutely.
Obviously, if she is referred to as
Absolutely.
Theotokos, yes.
Right. Well, Theotokos, and everything we say about her is in reference to him, right? So that she is the birth giver of God is a theological statement.
Gotcha.
Right? There was a time when someone else decided that he wanted to say Christotokos, that she was the birth giver of Christ, because this particular fella didn't like that God would be so slandered as to be associated with humanity too much, right? But in our theology, Christ has got to be fully God and fully man, because he is the healing of ancestral sin, right? He is the healing of death. And any part of humanity that he does not have, when he becomes incarnate, he doesn't heal. So if she's not fully human, then humanity is not fully healed.
It's amazing how...
she must be fully human,
right.
And then he gets his humanity from her.
It's amazing how the theology and the icons, and it all just ties together.
It has to.
And this is what strikes me about Orthodox worship. It's a rich, rich tradition, beautiful sensory and so forth. And I appreciate you sharing it with us today. Again, it's something that's not well known, but I thank you for coming and sharing the slides and your knowledge and your talent, especially.
It's been my pleasure.
All right. I feel like we just scratched the surface. Maybe we can do
Yeah.
another program in the future. But Andy, thank
like.
you so much for coming to visit with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right.
I've enjoyed it.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. Again, I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt, and I hope you'll join us next week here on App TV as we continue to explore the diversity of religions in the High Country. The Reverend Tamara Franks will join us next week and talk about the United Church of Christ in the High Country. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.